Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland. I wanted to start my contribution for a few minutes to make a couple of what I consider to be really important points, but also to start with, I think it's really good that the British Parliament is discussing this fundamental issue, and most of the speech I've agreed with. I've disagreed with the Scottish National Party, but I think it's really important that we recognise that sometimes we need that clash of view, that clash of opinion, in order to establish better public policy. And I say that as somebody who utterly supports the continuous at-sea deterrent, and I utterly support the fact that it is representative, it is to an extent a political declaration of the importance of our country on the world stage. And I have no problem at all with actually stating that. That is not an old-fashioned view, as was stated. That is not a view that somehow we shouldn't be proud of saying in this Parliament. We are a senior member of NATO. We are a senior power in the world, and we are a member of the we're a permanent member of the Security Council. Those are fundamental issues for our country and bring with it fundamental responsibilities. And part of that, in my view, not held by everyone in the chamber, but held by me, is that responsibility means something when it comes to military deployment, diplomacy and our view of the world. And I think our country makes a massive contribution to stability and peace in many areas of the world. And part of that is the deterrent. Now, it's no good. I say this to the Secretary of State, and I was really pleased in his remarks, and indeed the remarks that many other honourable members have made, that we have in this Parliament, I think, spent a lot of time where we simply assert the need for the deterrent. We don't argue the case. We don't take on, in a proper intellectual way, those who would oppose that. We simply dismiss it. And I think that's wrong. It is perfectly, as my honourable friend for North Durham said, it is perfectly possible and it is feasible and it is a philosophy that some people have, that having a nuclear deterrent is fundamentally wrong. And we should accept that and argue it rather than simply dismiss it. Let me say this. I think some of the arguments that have been made are really important, but I think this has to be one in our country again, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have to tell the Minister, as somebody who supports this is not a universally held view across the country. It is not something, not just in Scotland, across the whole of the UK. There are people in my own party, people in my own family, people in my own community, who do not agree with what I am saying. They, for example, will say, Vernon, how do having nuclear weapons defend us against terrorism? Well, of course, it's not meant to defend us against terrorism. But it's no good just saying that. You have to argue that. You have to say that. This is not meant to defend against terrorism. We have other ways of defending ourselves against terrorism, through special forces, through policing, through prevent, all of those sorts of things. But as many people in this chamber have raised, we are witnessing, first of all, a rise in the activities of Russia and other states. So not simply rogue states. We used to say, well, there's rogue states. What happens if North Korea? But it's not that. It's actually in the state of Russia and what is happening with respect to that. That is a very real threat to our country, to Western Europe and to democracy, as far as I can see. But we have to explain that, and we have to actually put that point of view. Many of my constituents do not see Russia as a threat in terms of them using nuclear weapons against us and why we have to have nuclear weapons in order to deter them. They don't. And so it's incumbent upon people like me to say it is important for the stability of the alliance, the stability on which NATO vis-à-vis Russia works, that nuclear deterrent is in place, and the concept of mutually assured destruction is something which actually I think does bring stability. But it can't just do it, you have to argue that. It's similarly with, I understand the Scottish National Party, where they're coming from, and I think it's perfectly legitimate to challenge them and to say you may have a non-nuclear policy in terms of Scotland. How does that fit with respect to membership of the NATO alliance? That's a perfectly reasonable thing to argue. It's not dismissing what they're saying, but it is a challenge. And it's not only people in this Parliament who challenge that. They will know, the Scottish National Party will know, at their own conference a few years ago, in 2012, members left the Scottish National Party, resigned from the Scottish National Party, because they saw it as a betrayal of the policy that had always said that NATO was a nuclear alliance and having a non-nuclear Scotland was inconsistent with being members of NATO. Indeed, one said, "I cannot belong to a party that quite rightly does not wish to hold nuclear weapons on its soil, but wishes to join a first strike nuclear alliance." And that's a challenge to the Scottish National Party. It's not condemning that, but that's a challenge, and they will have that argument within themselves. All I'm saying is, I believe in a continuous at-sea deterrent, and therefore it's important that I argue why I think that brings stability to our country. But let me say this as well, Madam Deputy Speaker. The challenge for people like me, and the challenge for this Parliament, and the challenge for the Defence Secretary, the Chair of the Defence Secretary, and all of my honourable friends as well, is do we actually mean, when President Obama made that brilliant speech, which inspired the world in Prague, I think it was, when he talks about global zero, he said he wanted a world where nuclear weapons didn't exist. When does this Parliament ever, Madam Deputy Speaker, debated how we re-energise, re-infuse the drive for multilateral nuclear disarmament? The Minister quite rightly pointed to the last Labour government, and this government, to be fair, have reduced the number of nuclear weapons and the number of nuclear warheads. Who's got a clue that we've done that? Who's got a clue? The honourable member who speaks for the Green Party will condemn any possession of nuclear weapons. Those of us who support, and that's a reasonable position to have, those of us who support having nuclear weapons, how often have we gone out and explained to the British public how we believe that we can still defend our own country, but we can do it with less warheads, less missiles in each of the submarines? That's the challenge as well. How do we re-energise the Non-Proliferation Treaty? How do we energise... I will just in a moment, and then because I'll finish in a minute or two. How do we re-energise multilateral talks? These are big strategic questions for our country. Even if it's an independent Scotland, massive strategic questions for us. Massive strategic questions for NATO. When do we ever debate that? Rather than just simply hurl, accusations at one another. I say there's a real... I haven't forgotten. There is a real need, and I say this to the Defence Secretary. How do we re-energise those non-proliferation talks, that non-proliferation treaty? And do we really mean that we want to have a multilateral process which leads to global zero? I will, and then I'll finish, Madam Deputy Speaker.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, but on that issue of a good issue of how do we revitalise the multilateral talks, doesn't he agree that we'd have a better chance if our government had taken up their potential seat at the negotiations for the UN ban treaty that had 122 countries supporting it? That is multilateral. It's exactly multilateral. Why weren't we there?
Well, there is the debate to be had about whether that's multilateral or not. But look, the point I'm making, there is a debate to be had about that, about whether it's multilateral. I believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are a global power. I think we're a global force for good. I'm not ashamed to say that. And I think as part of that, our possession of nuclear weapons is accepted by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We legally hold those weapons. And that contributes, in my view, to global stability and peace across the globe. I also think, alongside that, we need to be more assertive in the way that we explain that to the British public as a whole. But also, the cost for that, alongside that, is to say to the government and to ourselves and to this Parliament, if we do accept that, we also have a price, which is to actually drive forward with respect to multilateral disarmament and to really mean it when we say, as President Obama did, that we want a world that is completely free of nuclear weapons. We can achieve that, but we do it together, not on our own.
Bill Grant.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Gedling.